What's that? Uh-oh. Well, I'll do my best. As I told you when I got to say a little bit on Thursday, last night, I don't know what day that was, last night, I really came into a sense of justice work at Union Theological Seminary, which is a very intense, wonderful place and a very political place. And I spent a lot of time in my 20s on the streets or learning activism from mostly people of color-led movements in New York City. And I used to, as I was sort of wrestling with questions about whiteness in the context of my own justice commitments, think, okay, we got to be out here changing structures and systems and fighting and protesting and sitting in and facing down the police. And like every time I hear people talking about all this touchy-feely whiteness stuff, right? No touchy-feely stuff. So fast forward 22 years, and I just wrote a book on parenting, which sort of seems like touchy-feely stuff to me. And what I realized as I was journeying towards the point at which I really needed to write that book was that, in fact, part of the reason that our structures and our systems are as they are, and part of the reason they remain unchallenged by the demographic majority in some places, is because those of us who are white, or those of us who have been formed in sort of dominant, whether it's maleness, heterosexuality, whatever identity formation, but especially race and colonialism, those of us that are sort of embody those identity attributes or that formation, it's not like we woke up one day and said, I think I'm going to be a white supremacist, right? I was raised by two really good white people. And by my mid-20s, I had no idea how to do racial justice work as a white person. And I realized, as I was starting to need to write this book, that the touchy-feely stuff is not just that. In fact, there's this deep, deep, deep questions about formation that I really believe if we want a different future, we have to dive deep and get serious about. And so in some ways, I kind of am laughing at myself because the most speaking I've been doing in the last year has been around talking about race with kids and talking about identity. And in ways that, 15 years ago, I might have in a way that I think was probably also developmentally appropriate, but also really kind of naive, been like, well, that's just sort of white navel-gazing stuff. Nope. I mean, that risk is always there. But white people and dominant settler people, we show up in the world in particular ways for reasons that are deep. And changing our ideas up here, that's the easy part. That's the easy part. So what I want to share tonight, and why it's such a gear shift, is I want to share some of my wrestlings with parenting two young white children. My kids are 9 and 7. And as I was spending a lot of time with communities after Dear White Christians in spaces like this, really starting in 2014, over and over the questions would come up from adults who have kids in their lives. It's not just a parenting conversation. Okay, like I get this, we're on board, we're trying to figure out how to move. What do we do with the kids? And I was like, I don't know. Then I was like, well, what am I doing with my kids? And I was doing some things, and I wasn't doing some other things. So tonight I'm going to invite us to think about formation and the day-to-day moments in which identities of dominance, especially around issues of race and racial differences, get built. And what I want to do is share a number of stories that I think start to map some of the terrain that we need to find some better footing on if we want a different future. And my caveat, as it was this morning, is that there may be some sort of pivots we have to do with one another for the U.S. context relative to the Canadian context. But my deep suspicion is that many of the patterns and trajectories are very, very similar if we just changed a few of the words. So I want to start with a story, actually. This is a true story, a story of a Des Moines public school teacher. I live in Des Moines, Iowa, most of the year. And a Des Moines public school teacher who is also a mom shared this story with me. And she said this. She said, I was so relieved when my second grader came home after her school's Martin Luther King Jr. celebration. I'd worried about what she would be taught. I figured they might sugarcoat things, as we sometimes do when we talk about history. But when she came home, she was so excited about everything she'd learned, and her school had done a great job. But then, after sharing all she'd learned, my daughter turned to me and she said, "You know what, Mom? I'm so glad we're white." And I thought, oh my God, do we say that? So let's imagine that this child had been Native American. And she'd come home after a day at school where indigenous resistance movements were being celebrated and Native leaders were being remembered and honored. And this child had said, "Mom, I'm so glad we're Osage. Right? I'm so glad we're Cherokee." I don't think her mom's first response is going to be like, "Oh my God, oh no," right? And very possibly black children in that actual second grade class did go home that day and say, "Guess what, Dad? I am so glad we're black." To which I can imagine many a father having said, "Indeed, we are glad we're black," right? But the racial landscape is fundamentally different if you are raising white children, right? If you're committed to equity and if you value justice, but you live in an unjust society that also privileges you and has given you unjust benefits at the expense of others, you face very real conundrums that show up in a statement like, "I'm so glad we're white, Mom," from a second grader. Oh my God. Do we say that? So these conundrums impact children from the earliest of days, white children. And we know, of course, that race and identity difference impacts all children's development in any context where physical differences are markers of how we are embodied, right? So we know that race impacts all children. We know that all children need support to navigate a society that is both diverse and unjust. I heard that in some of our panelists' words the first evening, especially when I believe it was Janelle was talking about the significance of the way her parents and her family sort of equipped and supported her in understanding her identity and her place and her community's experiences in the world. So we know all children need that support. But we also know that parents of children of color, and my data here is going to be all U.S. data, but I suspect that there's sort of deep parallels, explicitly teach their children about the ways that race matters in their lives at rates 2 to 5 times higher than do white parents in the U.S. In contrast, 75% of white U.S. American families who have kindergartners, that's 5 years old, quote, never or almost never talk about race with theirs, okay? And that is a lot of white silence. And that's what I want to talk about tonight, what racial silence looks like around dominance, what white silence look like. I want to talk about why it's so dangerous, what it develops in youth, in kids and youth. This is not just a young kids conversation, and I'm going to say more about why this isn't just a parent conversation. This conversation pertains to everyone in this room, regardless of your identity, regardless of where you might operate relative to children or youth. And I also then want to talk mostly about what some of our counter strategies, what some of the counter responses we need to start developing. We don't really have that many. We just haven't done that work. So I'm wondering if I don't know if this would have crossed into the Canadian social media context, but spring of last year, did any of you see the story about the 2 4-year-olds? I'm seeing some nods, who were best friends. And one of them was white, and one of them was African American, and they got matching haircuts. And they got matching haircuts. Why? The folks that were nodding, what? Yes, they wanted to trick their teacher, right? She wasn't going to be able to tell. They got matching haircuts. She wasn't going to know who was who, right? And it was a really sweet story. It was very, very sweet. Their friendship was very sweet. And I think that's partly why it got so much attention. I mean, it was like, I saw it everywhere. It was even on actual television. That's saying something. But it also got attention, I started to think, because it seemed to be evidence that white silence is a good strategy for raising kids. It seemed to show somehow that kids can be taught not to see color and difference, and B, that if they can, that's a good thing. Okay? The white boy's mom actually told the media that his inability to see difference was a parenting success because she said, quote, "I just taught him to love everyone the same." Okay, those are really nice words, but this is a version of what in the U.S. we call colorblindness. And this colorblind teaching, which actually is better named white silence because communities of color and indigenous communities don't do this, right? It's really a better name would be white silence. I think we need to shift the language about that. But it's really common in white families and in white networks. So in church spaces in the U.S., as I was talking about this morning, we've mostly moved beyond that explicit claim that we're not supposed to see difference. We've mostly started to say, like, diversity is good and God created us diverse, right? And so we want to notice it. But we still face very real conundrums about how we're supposed to notice it. So, for example, I want to share another story, and this is from a different mom. This mom said to me, "I've always taught my children to treat everyone with kindness. And they have friends of lots of different races and lots of different cultures. They never cared about what someone's race was, though, until they came home after Martin Luther King Jr. Day." This is like a theme in U.S. households. Martin Luther King Jr. gives white families like headaches in the U.S. because we don't know what to do when our kids come home and start talking about race. They're seeing difference. And she said to me, then suddenly they were talking about people's race all the time. And so they say things like, "Our friend Joe, he's black, right?" And I really don't think it's good for them to focus on people's race and put them in boxes. Isn't that the opposite of what we're supposed to be doing? Now, this mom is valuing diversity. She said, my kids have friends of lots of different races and cultures. This is not someone who's diversity averse, but she's afraid that sort of noticing it, naming it, is going to backfire for her children. And the fact is, it's true. It could, right? Because there are more conundrums that pop up here. Like, what does it mean to say that Joe is black? What are her children thinking that means? And does Joe identify that way? And what are her kids thinking they know about Joe just because he might be black? And indeed, isn't making assumptions about people based on their racial identity exactly what we have learned not to do? And of course, it's a problem if children, but especially white children, are running around pointing at people, labeling them, right? But even if these backfires happen, things will backfire even more if this mother succumbs to the temptation, thus, to respond with white silence. If she defaults to generic teachings about equality, or loving everyone the same, or even underneath our skin, we are all just human, right? Language that is very prominent in the church. If that's the default, it will backfire. And we know this because there was another study in 2006 on about 100 white families in the U.S. who had self-reported that their approach to teaching about race was to explicitly teach their kids, everybody's equal, everybody's equal, everybody's equal. Okay, these were not equity-averse families. They were saying, you need to know this, everybody's equal. Researchers asked children in this study a very blunt question. They asked them this question, when their parents weren't in the room, do your parents like black people? What do you think those kids said? 38% of them, 38% of kids in these everybody's equal families said, I don't know. 14% of them said, nope, my parents don't like black people. So it turns out that everybody's equal and diversity versions of that are literally so abstract for young children, they have no idea what it means. They don't have any idea they are supposed to connect it to actually valuing people, whatever their history, their skin tone, their hair texture, their accents, their names, their language. And everybody's equal teaching does nothing. I'm not overstating. It does nothing to counteract racism in children. Zero. We have many studies that make clear that this is the case. So there's a final type of silence that I want to mention in passing, and because we kind of bumped into it a little bit this morning, so it's sort of a theme that I think is consistent throughout this larger conversation we're having. And it's the silence that can very much be present even when we are taking a deep dive into diversity or multiculturalism or intercultural language. And that's this, that there is simply and unequivocally a fundamental difference between living in a diverse society and living in a white settler hierarchy. Those are just not the same thing. Even if we have elevated, as it seems you all have, and you must continue to do, treaty language that emphasizes mutuality, right, and exchange and reciprocity, deeply important, and yet history is still present in the moment, right? We heard this a little bit around the film conversation this afternoon, such that it's fundamentally different to be in even that context that we heard, around which we heard the film, a Mennonite child in that context and a child of the young Chippewa Nation in that context. It's not the same, even if you're teaching valuing diversity. If we lived in diverse nations or diverse societies that were fair and didn't have histories of violence, we could just celebrate difference, teach our kids that. That would be great, and we could go on our merry way, but that's not what we live in the States or here. The reality is we are not just different. The reality is some children and youth receive benefits, protections, recognition, and access that other children simply do not receive. Okay? So diversity gets us closer, multiculturalism gets us closer to talking about difference in ways that we need to, but unless done in a particular way, they don't engage racism or anti-indigenous trajectories and histories, right? And the thing is, if we don't start engaging racism with our children very young, if we can't teach them about racism, we can't bring anti-racism into the vision of possibility for them. They can't do that if we shield them from teaching them about racism, right? So all of a sudden you've got Jen Harvey, who's 22, running around Union Theological Seminary going, well, yes, I see racial injustice, but I don't know what the heck to do about that. Because there were no mentors in my life at the time I started noticing difference in inequity to say, hey, this is what it looks like. Let's talk about this in a 5-year-old age-appropriate way. And diversity definitely can't get through the conundrum of, Mom, I'm so glad we're white. Oh my God. What, do we say that? Okay. So diversity and multiculturalism can be their own forms of silence, even if we're talking about difference all over the place. So before I want to sort of give some examples of how silence, what it yields, some of its dangers, I want to emphasize here then that this is not just a parenting problem, which is why it's an especially critical conversation for the church, I think, because plain and simple, there's a ton of adults involved in raising children. That's a generational work. It's not only about this individualistic parenting idea we might have, right? It's coaches, it's clergy, it's teachers, it's grandparents, it's someone in the grocery store who models an intervention when someone who is indigenous or African American or Latino is being treated in a way that a lack of dignity is clear, right? Everybody's raising children all the time. So it's not just about parents. It's also not just about white kids. Because those of us who are white or who embody other forms of dominant identity, especially around issues of settler colonialism, what we find ourselves stuck on or able to say or not say to children about race and anti-racism and our own histories has everything to do with where we as adults are. You know, I get stuck in conversations with my kids when I get nervous and anxious because the fact is that's where I'm at, and so I don't know how to translate it, right? In contrast, like I know that I don't really like to eat vegetables, but I have no problem saying to my kids why they need to eat them, right? Because I get it. I'm there. I make myself do it sometimes. But if I can't do something, it's because I haven't quite gotten through it myself, right? So this isn't just about youth and kids. The developmental socialization I'm talking about is part of the reason we're so stuck in the church around deeply anti-racist, pro-justice education work. When we don't know how to help folks get through stuff, it's because we haven't really worked through it ourselves, so we don't have much to point to. And then lastly, this probably maybe doesn't need to be said, but I want to say it. This is not just about white kids, right? Because white silence impacts children of color, immigrant children, and eventually teenagers and 20-somethings and young professionals who come into contact with white children and eventually teenagers and 20-somethings and early professionals. And I see this in my college classrooms all the time. The way youth have been raised in our U.S. culture has set up my 20-year-olds, all of whom are bright, engaged, interested, curious, and want to learn, and we try and have a conversation about race in the classroom, and it's a setup. Because my white students can't do it, and my students of color are so angry that they can't do it. Appropriately so. And it's not those 20-somethings' fault that they can't do it yet. Nobody has taught them how. So why is white silence so dangerous? What does it yield? I want to give a couple of examples. I think for those of us who have parish contexts, we were talking this morning about Christian education. I really believe this is like urgent denominational church dialogue and curriculum building we have got to start to do, because people are always asking for resources right now on this, and I don't have any to show you. There may be some, and maybe folks in this room know some of them, but we need to be building these, right? So I'm going to do a quick pass at what it looks like among young kids and a quick pass about how it shows up in teenagers. And I was talking with someone whose name was Joel this morning. He couldn't be here tonight, but who was sharing a story with me this morning that exactly, I said, oh my gosh, we're going to talk exactly about that tonight. So this is going on in Canada too. So young kids. We know from many, many studies that children internalize all kinds of perceptions, but internalize racist perceptions of themselves and others by ages 3 and 4. By the age of 5, kids recognize that different racial groups are treated differently, and they understand something about racial social status. Okay? They also know this. I think that first piece is certainly, I can imagine the ways, especially how prominent and visible in a really powerful way Indigenous settler dialogues clearly are here in the Canadian context, that young children who are white are clear there's a social status, right, whether or not their families are actually explicitly talk about that with them. So I'm sure they're picking up even many more things than white U.S. American kids pick up. So that's good. But in addition to that, in addition to young children developmentally picking up on this stuff, they also know by the age of 5, especially in the U.S., that they aren't supposed to talk about that in front of adults. So there's been studies where they've not let the kids know an adult was listening, and the kid would shift what they said. They would use racialized language in their play, but what they would say to the teacher is that person was being mean, even though they had all had this racial conversation, okay, because they know adults can't handle it. So there was a study, in the same preschool study, it's about 10 years old now, but the sociologist in this context of a preschool that was very racially diverse, had lots of multicultural curriculum, had lots of immigrant, first and second generation immigrant communities as part of it, was really pluralistic. She found that kids would play with larger social messages about race over and over again, messages that adults in their lives were assuming were going right over their head. And the one example that just really stood out to me when I read this book was this one. This is all her language. She said that there was a white girl pulling 2 other girls in a wagon. And one of the girls in the wagon was white, and one of the girls was Asian. And the wagon gets stuck, and the Asian girl jumps out to help. And the white girl responds this way, quote, "No, you can't pull this wagon. Only white Americans can pull this wagon. Renee has her hands on her hips and frowns at Ling Mei. The Asian girl tries again to lift the handle of the wagon, and Renee again insists that only white Americans are permitted to do this task. Okay. This is a 4-year-old using very sophisticated assumptions about who's American in her play. Very sophisticated. Okay. I'm suspecting there might be folks in the room right now who are experiencing a very powerful temptation, maybe, to go, oh my gosh, what are they teaching that child at home? Anybody thinking that? I hear that all the time. I used to say that before I became a mom. We need to resist that temptation. Because maybe that's what's going on at home, but very possibly that's not what's going on at home. Because that's not how this works. We like to think that when kids display bigotry, that's the result of a few bad adult apples. Okay? Oh, those parents, right? We're much wiser to understand that racism, disparaging images of Native peoples, is more like smog. That's Beverly Daniel Tatum's notion, not mine. We breathe it in every day, Tatum says. And she says, if the problem is smog, then white silence is just as likely to result in that wagon encounter as is someone at home explicitly saying, like, only white Americans are citizens, right? That's actually less likely that someone said that explicit thing. White silence is basically the equivalent of refusing to give your 4-year-old a breathing mask when they live in smog. And I would not do that as a parent. If I had access to a breathing mask, I would put it on my child. So she just breathes in racism, negative stereotypes about people of color and indigenous peoples, and breathes back, and false beliefs about her own superiority, okay? And then she breathes it right back out into the world by age 4. Smog is that powerful. I know smog is real. This took no convincing for me. My children have 2 moms. Neither my partner or I are particularly wed to stereotypical notions of gender. And I could tell you plenty of stories about my children, my 2 girls, saying highly sexist things in our home. And they did not come from me, at least that I was aware of. My favorite nightmare, my daughter H, she's now 9, but at the time she was 4. She's very confident, that's how I'd put it. She proudly announced to me that God must be a boy when she was 4. And I tried to calmly ask her why she thought that. And, well, she said, well, God is a boy's name, obviously. And then my 4-year-old daughter, being raised by 2 genderqueerish moms, said this to me. And God has to be a boy because boys are better than girls. I would not make that story up. Hashtag feminist religious scholar mom fail. To date, the longest Facebook therapy session of my life. I was barely on Facebook in those days, and I was like, please help me. It was like 500 comments as all of my theological friends were like diving to the rescue. And we're not even silent about gender in our home. Okay? That's how powerful smog is. So we need to get really serious about this. Another reason that silence is so dangerous is kids just notice everything. Who's here in this space? Who's not here in this space? Who's doing what work? Who's in positions of leadership? And when you have a very hierarchically organized society, right? And your child doesn't see an indigenous doctor, an Osage teacher, an African-American pastor, they just make conclusions without adult help. No adult help needed. They don't see black people in leadership. Well, black people must not be leaders. That's what a 4-year-old brain does. They see Latino people in the U.S. primarily doing service and custodial work. Oh, Latino people can't be teachers. They can't be doctors. That's what they conclude, okay? And a lot of time adults just don't even know this is happening. Okay, here's the teenager description. Another another scholar, a rhetorician, actually, not a sociologist, but spent a year doing interviews in Northern California high school. This was like 10 years ago. Very racially diverse high school in a very liberal part of the state. And they were doing multicultural education there. So again, this was not a place where they thought they were doing white silence. They weren't trying to do that. So she started each interview over the course of the year that she was there by asking young people their age, their sex, gender, their grade, and their race ethnicity, which seemed pretty straightforward to her. And something fascinating happened. White students that she interviewed could not answer the last part of the question. They did fine with age, sex, grade, but when they got to the race question, they would start to squirm. So any of you working with youth in your churches, this is really, really important. And I was having a conversation with a pastor this morning about this precise thing, and I was terrified by what he shared with me. In much grief, he was sharing it. She found that some of these youth would give her ironic answers. So one boy, she writes, she was talking to him and asking him these questions, and he abruptly, high schoolers are so awkward anyway, but he abruptly took on a fake British accent and said, "Well, I'm the whitest of the white boys." And I'm sure that was not a good British accent. I'm sorry. Sorry, Julie. But he kind of like celebrates his whiteness. And then other students play ignorant or get uncomfortable, and so they'll say things like, "Well, I'm white." And then they will qualify it and say, "I guess," or "I don't know, I'm white." And as she pushes, what she finds out is that there's two things going on, at least. One, these students are literally not sure if saying I'm white is the same thing as saying I'm racist. And they know they don't want to be that. So they squirm when they get asked that. Okay? The other thing that's going on is that they associate whiteness with cultural blandness and a lack of coolness. Sometimes this is kind of a joke in the school, but other times it's very, very clearly painful to these youth, okay? And it's just this one little basic demographic question that raises all this stuff. So this is really, really important. Because let's imagine you're at an age where uncool is about the worst thing you can be, right? Not that any of us would know anything about that. And you're being told multiculturalism is a value. Diversity, we celebrate it. But everybody knows, but probably no one's explicitly talking about it. You aren't really supposed to celebrate your diversity, right? Your whiteness. There may be more European heritage cultures alive in Canada than there are in the U.S., but in the U.S., we have almost none of that, right? We've assimilated into whiteness about every which way we can. And so you're running around, you can't embrace your own race, everybody else gets to embrace theirs, and you're supposed to enjoy embracing your much cooler peers' difference all the while. What do we think is going to happen? So what happens is these white kids, lots of them are really resentful. And they start to resent the whole enterprise of multiculturalism and diversity. And they start to get really hostile, not to the adults in their lives who have modeled or not modeled for them how to navigate this. They turn that hostility where? On their peers, right? So everybody has been set up to fail here. Everybody. Because it actually can amp up hostility towards students of color in those spaces. Now, this is all on a good day. This was all pre-2016, and the kinds of things that are creeping into many of our nation states, and certainly most vitriolically in the United States. And it frankly terrifies me because I'm fairly confident that white national movements have figured this out. And the pastor I was talking to this morning was telling me a story of, I think, a 13 or 14-year-old in his youth group. And he was like, "This is what's going on." And I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is what we're going to talk about a little bit tonight." Those youth are ripe for the picking. We woke up at Drake University, and I know it happened in Canada too, about a year ago, with signs all over campus that said, "It's okay to be white." Nationalist groups are recruiting based on that alienation right there. Everyone else gets to have a race. What's wrong with mine? If we don't have that conversation with our youth, we are in deep trouble. Deep trouble. So we have to get serious about breaking silence. And doing so, I believe, is an urgent investment in the long generational work. It's going to be a long work, but we have to get at it like yesterday, so tomorrow morning, of raising a generation of healthy white kids. Okay? And that is for the good of all kids. That's not just a white people, settler people conversation. The church could leverage incredible moral impact for political good on this precise question because we have kids in our buildings. For racial justice, we could do it if we decide that we need to figure it out and we want to figure it out. So I want to just give 4 little examples of what it could look like to break silence, what some of the strategies we need to use. The first is this. We need to actively, proactively, and from much younger ages than we think, start using race and difference-conscious language and creating race-conscious, justice-conscious schemas in those young brains. Okay, and that's what, let me tell you what that means by way of analogy. As I said, my kids have always had, they've always just known that families can have 2 moms. This is not a thing they had to learn. I'm not going to have to wake them up someday when they're 14 and say, well, guess what? We haven't talked about this with you because we didn't think you were ready, but you can have 2 moms, right? That's absurd. So when dominant culture tells them 2 girls can't get married or you have to have a mom and a dad, my kids hear those messages and they just think they're strange, right? They think those kinds of messages, even though those are the dominant messages they actually hear, they think those messages are the outliers. And I think that's great. They never think they're the outliers. Now, they will come to know, and we're certainly having harder conversations about heterosexism, but when we have those conversations, they've already internalized a many different kinds of families' understanding of the world. It's their sense of what's normal, okay? And that's what schemas do. They help us organize and make sense out of information. And for my kids then, multiple moms is just a thing. You can have as many as you want. So we have to make talking about race and anti-racism. We need to talk about justice and injustice. And we also need to constantly tell our kids and show our kids the truth that people are constantly acting against racism, against colonial-settler violence, and for justice. We need to and that's normal to do that. It's normal to fight injustice when you see it. We need to make that part of our kids' assumption about the world. That's what you're supposed to do if you're a human. You're supposed to fight it, right? And there's a lot of ways to do that, and we can talk some more about those if that's of interest to folks in the room. But early and often race talk and early and often ism talk is actually deeply essential. And the church really doesn't do this very well. We do a lot on diversity talk. We don't do much on ism talk in the church, okay? Secondly, racial scripts as in a play, are very, very powerful, very powerful. So I've heard lots and lots of white parents in my context talk about putting their kids in diverse spaces, which is something I value. They do that on purpose, and then they talk about being really disappointed when their kids couldn't sustain relationships across lines of difference over time. They don't really understand why. And one of the things that we all need to come to terms with, and I think the TRC dialogues you are having here helps with this tremendously. We would benefit a great deal in the U.S. from doing more of that, is that we have to really come to terms with whatever our unique personality and commitments and our identities, all of our lives are unfolding in this larger story, right? And the story began long before we got here, and it gets rewritten every single day, and it has deeply interpersonal impact. So I've been handed a role, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that I spent the 90s in New York City actively organizing against police brutality there in the 90s. It doesn't matter that I did that the day after a black person is killed in the United States by police. When I'm walking down the street and I encounter an African-American person who I don't know, I am just another white person. That's the role. All of those wounds, all of those traumas, all of that violence, it mediates our relationship, okay? And usually it makes it difficult for us to go past a first encounter, actually, because we're always coming to one another through all of that history. So racial scripts are about our collective relationships. They operate in our kids' lives, in youth lives. They operate in our adult lives with the parishioners we work with. They are operative all the time. And so we can't think that our youth are immune, and we've got to start to name that with them young and teach them how to interrupt the scripts. Because here's the thing. If my daughter, who is 9, is only ever taught, what do we teach our kids in white communities about police in the United States? We teach them, if you're in danger, go to a police officer, they're safe, okay? That's the message. If that's all I teach my 9-year-old, my white 9-year-old, her relationship with her black cousin, who is 12, who is necessarily being taught that police are complicated for him, that's what he's got to be taught, and it may still not save his life, their friendship will be impacted. They can cousin love each other all they want right now, but by the time they're 14 and 17, they won't be friends because she will not be able to identify with him or take seriously his actual experience. So I can't just tell my daughter, oh, police are safe. That's how the script will play out if I don't do that. There's a really funny story about racial scripts that I'm going to skip. But I'll come back to it later if you want to hear it during the Q&A. Because I want to tell 2 other stories that feel more important to me. The other story, the third story, is that has to do with race being in our bodies and difference being in our bodies. And especially for communities that engage in ritual, I think this should make sense to us. And this is a story from this actual mom and my actual white kid. Do you guys have Chuck E. Cheese? Oh, no, you do. Oh, I'm sorry. I was at Chuck E. Cheese when my younger daughter was about 4, and I really think Chuck E. Cheese is the bastion of hell. I also thought, it's really hard sometimes to be a lesbian mom. We surely get a pass on having to go to Chuck E. Cheese. Nope. That's how normal we are. We get to go to Chuck E. Cheese. So there was a mostly white crowd in Chuck E. Cheese when my daughter was 4. It was very, very crowded. But amidst this very mostly white crowd, there was a group of young African-American kids, and they were running around enjoying themselves immensely. And there was nothing that was ever vocalized, but before very long, I could feel racial dynamics happening in the space, even though there were no words that addressed it. So I saw white adults kind of giving quick glances towards the kids. And they weren't hostile glances, but they just were sort of like out of the corner of their eye glances, which was sort of odd. And I also noticed there was a pronounced unnatural physical avoidance happening. So it was like really strange because the way we navigate our bodies in space, if it's crowded, is we make eye contact. Like if 5 of us try and suddenly go through that door, the first thing we're going to do is kind of look at each other and defer or not defer, right? No, it's like a black child would bump into a white adult and they would just keep walking like it didn't happen. Like, okay, oh, that didn't happen, right? It's very strange. So it was like we were closed up in these racial bubbles. At one point, I stepped up to help my young daughter play with a game. And a young boy, he was maybe 9, who was part of this group, he stepped up at the exact same minute to play, consistent with what was going on in the space. He didn't look at her or me, but we were going to have to figure out who was going first. So this was all like microsecond. This wasn't a long, drawn-out moment. In that exact same moment, this child had these beautiful, just gorgeous designs shaved into his hair. And I just stopped him and said, "Hey, I love your haircut." And he kind of looked up at me, and for a moment he looked very startled. And then he broke into a huge smile, and he just said, "Thanks." And then we all made eye contact and smiled, and it was all fine. I don't know who played first. I don't remember. And then what happened was, for the next hour at Chuck E. Cheese, this child and about 2 or 3 of the boys that he was with, I think they might have been brothers or cousins, they chased my daughter E around Chuck E. Cheese for the whole hour. And they kept coming up to her over and over her and giving her their tickets that they were winning at skee ball. You get the tickets you turn in. They were like literally they shoved hundreds of tickets into my daughter's hands. They'd be across Chuck E. Cheese, win at a game, and they would look for us and chase her and say, "Here, you can have these tickets too." And it was so sweet because she was little and they were older, and she's just like beaming because these older kids are loving her up like nothing else. And she left Chuck E. Cheese that day thinking she had like walked on the moon because she went home with so much plastic landfill garbage. Like, she couldn't have envisioned that in her wildest dreams. That was the only interracial interaction I saw at Chuck E. Cheese that day, that entire time I was there. And I don't know for sure, but my hypothesis is that racial divides, and in this case an unexpected crossing of one, had everything to do with that whole interaction. I know I felt relief at breaking out of the white racial bubble I was in, and I don't know what this child had anticipated. I certainly don't know exactly what he experienced, but his smile and what happened afterwards, because really what 9-year-old gives up their Chuck E. Cheese tickets, led me to think something welcome had happened for him that he had not expected. And I know that my daughter went home, because of the generosity of these kids, embodying an interruption of racial bubbles. And I could have never talked about that with words with her. She was 4, but she experienced it. And it will go away if it's not repeated, but it happened in her body. And racial dynamics have to do with that. Eye contact, how we hold our bodies. We can increase tension, division, and alienation with our bodies. We can also increase connection and meaningful relationships with our bodies. We've got to figure out how to think about that. Finally, we have to be willing to, this is absolutely the hardest one for me as a mom. We have to be willing to break young people's hearts. And I'm right now thinking about our conversation this morning about Tina Fontaine and the other person's name, Boucher. Thank you. We have to be willing to break young people's hearts, including our children's hearts. About a year ago, there was another mother and I. We were having a conversation. We were talking about the U.S. Racial climate. We were lamenting that together. She nodded at her child, her young white child who goes to school with my kids, and she said, "I'm just so grateful she doesn't have to worry about any of this yet." And I totally get it. I long to protect my children. We are living in violent, difficult days. And just like every other parent or adult with kids in their lives, I want my kids to have hope about the world and all its possibilities. But the truth is, there's nothing innocent about white innocence, ever. Not even in a 2-year-old. And in the face of racial injustice and anti-Indigenous and anti-Black violence, keeping white children innocent actually means we are bartering away their humanity. We are bartering it away starting young. So in fall of 2016, my students at Drake were organizing a protest. I direct a program there for students of color. And I said to my kids, remember when we talked about the men who were killed by the police? Well, my students are coming together today to protest to show that they want this to stop, and I'm going to go, and I'll take you with me if you want to go. And both of them said, yes, we want to go. And then they said, can we make signs? And I said, sure. What are your signs going to say, though? And in unison, my 2 daughters said, Black Lives Matter. So I said, sure, you can make those signs. That'd be great. So I've taken my kids to protest their whole lives, but by now they're old enough to be more fully engaged. Sometimes they chant. I still make discerning decisions about what types of protests to take them to. This is hard conversations, I think. No right or wrong answer. But they by now have both had a sense of what was going on. So we went to this protest. They participated with vigor. They spent nearly an hour physically present with Black people and Latino people and people of color, other people of color, and a few white people who were just there standing together to say, basta, enough. And so my kids then also saw young people leading and being brave and loud about the value of their own lives and about their right to be free. And they experienced these same young people and other adults asking them about their signs and affirming them for making their voices heard. And all of this was not only the moral right place to be for us, but it was powerful for their development, because what they experienced was that they had the capacity for anti-racist agency. They experienced it. And so that's how the story ended that day. But it was in the middle part of the story where I learned what it means to let my children have their hearts broken. So I walked down the stairs where my daughters were making their signs to tell them it was time to go. And when I came into the playroom where they were, I literally caught my breath when I saw my daughter H's sign. And this is what it said in green and red marker with hearts and stars all over it. It said, Black Lives Matter, M-A-T-E-R. They matter the same as white. Stop killing them. And then below that, she'd written the names of people in her life who she loves, and her sign put it this way. It said, people who are black, B-L-A-K, are T, her cousin, A, her other cousin, only their names were written out, and Toby, her aunt, my sister-in-law. And as you can imagine, I didn't just catch my breath. I literally felt my heart smash into about 1 million pieces. And what I remembered in that moment, observing that devastating but deeply gorgeous sign, was that these are simply not days in which any of us dare live without a broken heart, including my kids. Because if our hearts are not broken right now, then we are already lost because we've already lost a core part of her humanity. And so what I'm also holding on to and trying to learn to live with, it's very difficult, is this other recognition, and that's this, that at this point, my 8-year-old, she's 9 now, my 9-year-old is a whole and wonderful and smart and kind and beautiful and very happy child. She doesn't wake up in despair most days. But she's also already, and even in her not quite old enough to get it way, but she's starting to get it, she's also living with a broken heart. And she knows that. And my partner and I never have even said to her, your cousins and your aunt are black, and police violence put their lives in danger. We have never been that explicit. That would feel to me like too much, in part because I don't want to narrate their lives to her in that way, right? So we've never said that. But she's put the pieces together by the time she was 8. She knows racism is real, that it has real consequences for real, actual people, and she knows that her most beloveds are some of those people. And so she knew exactly what the stakes were in going to that protest. And she's still young and vulnerable enough that she would put it that way. She'd put her cousin's name on a sign, which, by the way, just so you know, I called my sister and my sister-in-law to make sure that was okay before I let her take the sign. My sister-in-law texted her and said, Harper, thank you for being my ally. So there's lots of uncharted territory here. We have had few models for helping dominant white settler peoples live resistance. When it comes to kids, this is scary. It's really hard. And in fact, those of us who are ourselves white or have been raised in settler colonial contexts in dominant ways, most of us are doing with our own youth what was done with us. Maybe a slightly better version of it, but probably lots of white silence in the mix. But here's the thing. The most truthful questions about charting this territory, about raising white kids and youth, doing that as pastor, as coaches, as teachers, are not exactly about how we measure it or exactly map out the perfect lesson plan, though we do need some of those. The most truthful questions aren't the practical ones. The most truthful questions simply have to do with whether or not we'll decide to be brave. Raising white kids for racial justice simply requires that we expose them to really hard truths. We've got to do it. And it means that we have to create space for them to not only hear that, but actually have their own relationship with injustice, to allow them to feel it and touch it and actually ache from its real costs, like my 8-year-old was aching that day. And it's tough. And I get it. It's counterintuitive to my parenting. But I'm convinced it's the most life-affirming thing I could possibly do for the future. For sure, it's the only way that my white kids remain human enough that they can fight for the humanity of those whose lives are actually at stake in this system, because the truth be told, my children mostly are not. And so as imperfectly as I'm doing it, as much as I wake up in tears and terror many days, as few maps as there are, I wouldn't try to do it any other way. And we in the church need to take this on and see that we need to not allow those of us we are convening in ritual space to not do it either. And we need to not ask them to do it alone. We need to find ways to support adults who have children in their lives to do this work together. So with all that uncertainty and the awkward and the unknowns, I would just say, and I'm sure you believe it too, our children's humanity and the lives and humanity of everybody's children on this precious earth deserve nothing less than that we be emboldened with courage together to try. So emboldened together, may it be so. Amen. So, I want to give you about 3 minutes of silence. And in that time, if you have a pen, that would be great. If you don't, you can do a map in your mind. And I won't forget you're here. I will stop you in 3 minutes, so don't worry. I would invite you to take on one or both of these questions. You're not going to be able to do complete answers in 3 minutes. I'm just asking for sort of immediate associations. You don't have to share anything you write down. Here's your 2 questions. As you think about what you just are absorbing, what feels the most challenging to you? What feels the most challenging? And or, as you think about what you are just absorbing, what gives you the most important glimmer of a new possibility? What gives you the most important glimmer of a new possibility? I'm just going to ask you to be quiet for a minute with your own thoughts on either or both of those questions. Okay, now what I'm going to ask you to do, and we will have time for some all-group discussion too, but I'm going to ask you to group up in no larger than groups of 3, if you would please. If there needs to be like a group of 4, that's fine, but I'm going to invite you to just circle up with 2 people near you that you would feel willing to share some with, and just talk a little bit about either or both of those questions, sharing only what you want to. And I'm going to, like every 3 minutes, just say, hey, make sure someone else is getting a turn to talk, just to gently support you and making sure you're inviting space for all voices. So make sure you know the names of the 2 folks you're talking to would be good. If you haven't started to hear from at least a second voice, you're going to want to do that about now or in the next minute. And again, make sure you're starting to move to a third person if you haven't already. About 2 more minutes before we'll come back together, just to keep you aware. So, friends, can we come back together just to give... I want to give some time before we close tonight. I would love for, if there are insights or questions that feel salient to be named when we're all together now, I would love to sort of use the last bit of our time to have space for that. So I'm going to invite you to do as you did this morning and come to the mic. Or if you, maybe I can translate for you if the mic feels like more than we need right now.